Year, everyone, and welcome to this very first edition of Dialogue in the year 2020. China rings in the new year with a new foreign investment law. Touted as landmark legislation, it aims to strengthen protections for foreign investors and create a more conducive business environment. So what changes does the new law feature? How will China ensure what it calls national treatment of foreign investors? What role, if any, did the Sino-U.S. trade war play in driving the new law? And will this law keep the Chinese market just as attractive to investors or make it even more attractive? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Liao Fan of the Institute of International Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. First of all, does the foreign investment law make any difference?
Huge difference, actually. A lot to say, but I'd like to highlight 3 points. First, in the past, actually, we have 3 different foreign investment laws dealing with different kind of enterprises, so-called equity joint ventures, contractual joint ventures, and so-called WFE, wholly foreign-owned enterprises. These laws inevitably result in some kind of fragmentation in the field of foreign investment. But now we have a uniform, single foreign investment law dealing with all kinds of foreign investment. This is a big change. And second, actually, this new law officially adopts a foreign investment administration model called national treatment, pre-entry national treatment plus negative list as compared to the past, which basically means, in general, foreign investment will be treated all the same as Chinese domestic investment and domestic investors. They will not be scrutinized just because they are foreign investment, they are foreign investors. So this is also a big change. And third, this new law, more than ever, emphasizes on the protection and the promotion of foreign investment. In the past, actually, our foreign investment laws sort of were more focused on the regulation side, but this new law are more focused on the promotion and protection of foreign investment. We can talk about the details, but I just make one example. The Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 are about the promotion and protection of foreign investment. They have altogether 19 provisions, while Chapter 4, which deals with regulation of foreign investment, has only 8 provisions. It can be a simple example to show that.
But the problem is that by this time, no full text has been delivered. And by the time this law was made public in March last year, many international observers pointed out, look, devils exist in details. What actually did they mean, David?
I think it's a misunderstanding of how long China's had to promulgate this new legislation, these new rules. This has been done in a very short period of time relative to any other country perhaps looking at something similar. The range is considerable. So all we can expect, even with the details, is a direction and an intention of the government. I mean, momentum of reform in China has been considerable, and this is a very strong example of how determined the government is to make a more balanced economy in the future. But I think another factor which is important is making all companies the same is a big thing, because in the beginning, foreign companies actually had huge privileges. They had tax breaks, they had special considerations in terms of their registration. They had many advantages over the same industries and equivalent companies that were locally owned. What this is leading towards is not just for foreign firms, but all businesses, particularly non-state-owned businesses in China, having similar treatment. So I think the critics expect too much. What we're getting actually is quite a lot.
The core concept of this foreign investment law, I'm afraid, is national treatment or level playing field. However, many international investors complain that they cannot enjoy equal access to, for example, government procurement programs. The Chinese authorities are accused of citing national security as a reason to reject their investment in the sensitive area or these sensitive areas. I wonder, David, can you first of all brief our foreign audiences about whether their grievances could somehow be eased with the approval of this law?
I think the intention of this law is to address those grievances, and those grievances were not unfounded. As a foreign enterprise in any country, you don't have the same networks, the same guanxi, you don't have the same often relevance to the kind of deals that are being offered, whether they're at a municipal level or at a state, a national level. So you're already at a disadvantage to some extent. But one of the challenges, I think, to foreign companies is to become a local company in China and not be a foreign company in inverted commas. Employ local people, have senior local management. That in itself starts to get you the kind of access that many of these foreign firms complain they don't have. So while it is not a level playing field, and there are few level playing fields anywhere in the commercial world, in China, I would say things have improved considerably if I look back over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. This going forward is quite a commitment on the part of the government, because the devil is in the detail, and we'll see in the coming 2 to 3 years how this settles down and what does this really mean for the functioning operation of foreign companies. I think in the circumstances it'll be better than things are now, but some of the bigger issues that the government needs to face is opening of some of the sectors that are currently restricted, particularly the finance sector. One, it's fair to do so because Chinese companies can own finance firms in the West, but it would help the reform of banking and finance in China to have a bit more foreign competition. So those are one of the areas that I think could be dealt with under this body of law, or at least the principles that this reform basically indicates.
So does the foreign investment law actually mean a free ticket for free access by overseas multinationals?
Technically it's not, because as I mentioned, now the administration model is so-called pre-entry national treatment plus negative list. Pre-entry national treatment means that we grant national treatment not only after the foreign investors enter into Chinese market, but also just at the point of entry, at point of establishment, they enjoy the national treatment. So this is a general principle. But meantime, we have a so-called negative list, which whose official name should be non-conforming measures or special administration measures, which means for specified sectors, for specified industry, the state can still impose some kind of limitation or even prohibition based on justified national concerns, for example, national security. But again, this should be a very, very narrow limit, a very, very narrow exception, and should be subject to very, very strict conditions and those kind of procedures.
David, what do you make of the negative list?
The negative list has been a number of things. It began when reforms were initiated essentially in the 80s as a way to protect China as a developing country, and it was correct. Then when China took very bold steps to reform its state-owned enterprises and even more dramatically its banking system in the late 90s, it was very much needed because these businesses were these sectors were very vulnerable. So in the process of going through those reforms, many of the major industries of China and many of the banks are actually pretty strong. So I think that the protection that they initially received was for the process of enduring their reform, their periods of vulnerability. But for them to exist to the extent they still do does denote a measure of protectionism. And I think that is one thing which the government has a number of motives on. The poorer motive is let's protect our banks because they will have an advantage in our own economy. The other motive is China remembers, as we all do, the global financial crisis in 2009 and the inherent instability of the international banking system with its highly speculative drivers, its great weaknesses with a broad range of derivatives. These are things which China doesn't have to the same extent in its banking system. So it fears the international contagion of global banking, and I think it's correct to do so. So I think, yes, we want more foreign banks and players in the sector, but also China's got to be careful what opening up means and to what extent it becomes a more Western-style system. China needs to become something other than the West. This needs to be a market that has characteristics of a balance of state involvement and stability that now we've lost in the West. That's why the Western economies they're booming in some ways, but they are inherently pretty unstable. The American economy is an example. So I think there's always a mixture of motives. Beijing's motives are usually pretty strong and pretty clear for the general benefit of the evolution of China. But at municipal levels, implementation is always a problem. So when it comes down to negative lists, you could say America has one because what it's doing to Huawei, or trying to do to Huawei, which has got nothing to do with national security. They're also using the same national security principle to block Mercedes-Benz imports out of Germany into the States. So these are tools that any government can use for bad ends. I think China has no choice because it is a market economy, because it is already connected to the world in an immensely complex way. It must go on undertaking these things and balancing itself. So in principle, I think it just keeps be transparent, revisit the security list, explain why some companies are blocked, be clear about issues of not just national security, but also this is still in part a developing country, and you can't just open the doors immediately. So I think it's a balance, but sometimes these things are used for ill, and sometimes in China that's the case.
So what do you think of the opening up itself? Does it mean unconditional, completely free opening up at this moment, given the negative list?
First, I'd like to make a footnote to the negative list. Then I'll answer this question. I mean, the negative list, actually, I want to make two additional points. First, when it was first invented in 2013 in the pilot Shanghai Free Trade Zone, the list was as long as nearly 200 provisions, and now the newest version is only 40-something provisions. So it has been greatly streamlined, which shows the determination of the Chinese leadership to further opening up the Chinese market. And second, I mean, what's more important about negative list is not only how many or how few provisions you have on it, but the way how you regulate those designated areas and these designated industries. You need to do that in a transparent way. Not only that I streamline the list, but also those kind of measures adopted to regulate these special areas should be updated. So that, I think, should be emphasized. As to the negative list and the opening up as a whole, I think we need to definitely make a balance. I mean, on one hand, I mean, China has been so integrated into the global economy and has benefited so much from it. And multinational trading system is so important to China and to its sustainable development. We should continue to open up the market. But meantime, we are still a developing country. Our per capita GDP is still very much lagged behind many countries. So we should not be considered, I mean, beyond our status quo, beyond what we can do. So I think we need to make a balance. I think that is what the negative list can play. What's the role, I mean, negative list together with other kind of things can play in this sense.
For a long time, both Europeans and Americans complained bitterly about the role of the SOEs and the relationship between the Chinese government and the market. It is in this area, perhaps China is not accepted as a market economy by most Westerners, except for perhaps New Zealand. So what do you think of this focal point of SOEs, David?
I think well, my own country's position on that was very thoroughly assessed, and the view was taken that China was relatively a free market economy, because America is not as free as we think. If you look at the government's relationship through military procurement, if you look at all the subsidies, it's billions and billions of dollars a year to give tax breaks so one company moves from one state to another. There are many state actors. MIT as a company, as a marvelous institution, is the product of military investment for technology since the 40s, particularly. So looking at China's openness and flexibility, I think that it is fair to say that China has been for some time a free market economy. The problem of the state-owned enterprises is that it is a legacy that comes from the time when this was a command economy. This was a wholly communist economy. The changes that have taken place in terms of reforming that have actually been over a very short period of time, a blink in an historical eye, actually. So if you look at where China sits now, yes, of course, not for foreign enterprises so much, but for the non-state enterprises that make up 70% of the drivers of the current economy, further reform of state-owned enterprises needs to take place. So it's for everyone that we need to have that happen. But the government, of course, is going to do that slowly and cautiously, because what China's trying to get right is what is the balance of government involvement in its economy and the extent to which this is an open, somewhat capitalist system. The West has never got it right. That's why you have these cycles of boom and bust. China is trying to get it right. So sometimes it will oversteer. But I think in the end, for practical purposes, the reform of state-owned enterprises in the future is a given. We just have to be a little more patient.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Liao Fan of the Institute of International Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Now, Fan, a lot of overseas media focus their attention on the implementation of some of the provisions. They say, as David said earlier in the first half of the program, devils existed in the details. Local authorities in China have become a headache for prospective overseas investors. They say some of the provisions and articles of the foreign investment law are likely to be banded, to be abused at the local level. For example, the alleged coercive transfer of high technology. Now, this is utterly forbidden by people like the Trump administration. Do you think this foreign investment law will make a big difference, and will overseas investors be allowed to make sure that the regulations and the provisions are implemented strictly in accordance with the law?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. You keep your fingers crossed.
Hopefully.
David, what are your expectations?
There are problems at a local level. I mean, a big part of our business is restructuring.
Obviously, the
companies.
Chinese government refuses to accept any international watchdog to step in.
They shouldn't. I mean, who gives up their commercial sovereignty for some other country to come in and see how they run things? We have the WTO. If America would stop trying to dismantle it, that is the best board, which China has been utilized since it ascended to the WTO.
But I'm afraid Mr. Lighthizer, for example, thinks that you have to sign the law, you have to allow the investors, the watchdog to step in, because you are held at the gunpoint of the American punitive tariffs. Fan?
Based on my knowledge of the text of the first phase agreement, there's not such kind of mandatory watchdog thing.
They tried, but they failed.
In the text, yeah. What I want to emphasize is that actually we should be hopeful with this new law, because more than ever before, it has showed the determination of the central government to really give the foreign investors and foreign investment some kind of teeth. For example, it mandates that local governments should honor their policy commitment to the foreign investors, and if they don't, if they default, they should bear the consequences. And it provides that actually whenever a law or regulation related to foreign investment is to be promulgated, opinions should be solicited in a proper way from foreign investors.
You have vaguely put your point on a very sexy issue as to the trade disputes, if any, between the U.S. and China. For example, the appellate body of the WTO has collapsed with only one judge remaining on the panel. In this way, who will or what kind of mechanisms will be held responsible for the settlement of trade disputes, David?
Well, basically, we've lost it because America has not wanted to be accountable to an international forum. So while dismantling the thing that we all depend on hugely, especially small countries, they are then saying that they want to become the arbitrary and the bilateral enforcer of such things. I look at also that as much as one can of what appears to be this coming trade agreement this year, and that agreement has nothing that they originally asked for, such as monitoring the management of the currency. So there's some vague language, but actually in the first round of the trade war, we can say in 2020, China won. And the tariffs were guns held to the head of the American consumer and businesses, especially the agricultural sector. The Chinese economy has not been hurt to any great extent so far by this trade war. So I think we're looking at a very interesting phase where if China can remain as steady as it has been, continue to reform its internal economy and open it in a way that foreigners can function better here, they are taking all the measures they need to counteract the current pressure from the United States. But there is one issue, which we, again, as foreign investors and people that help fix foreign investments, it's not coming into China that's the problem. It's not establishing a business that's the problem. It's when things go wrong. And we have a situation in Shandong at the moment where what we're looking for is a local county to ensure that the company, the local company, the partner, that they're sticking to the rules, which they're not. Those are the issues where often one struggles. I would say, though, across China, particularly in provinces like Zhejiang, cities like Beijing and Shanghai, now when there are issues, the way the law can be applied is improved hugely, particularly in intellectual property rights. So you've got a kind of patchwork in China of an improvement, and in some areas, as I've mentioned, it's not so good.
It seems David suggests quietly that the current war, the raging war between the United States and China, will make China great again. And that's the dream of, is that the dream of President Trump?
I'm not sure, but actually I agree with one point of David. Actually, if we withstand this kind of impact from the trade war and we continue our pace and we even expand our opening up policy, then we can sort of even benefit from this ongoing trade war because we can do something that in regular times we might not be able to do. So this could be like make advantage of a kind of crisis or of a kind of challenge.
For quite a while, Americans demand the greater opening up of the Chinese capital account and financial services. The issue is China is perhaps not ready. David, do you think there would be some glass ceiling or invisible obstacles to the opening up? What are the focal points our American and European competitors would keep their eyes on?
It's hard to say because they want to be able to compete here and they want to be able to compete in a system that resembles their own. I don't believe that the system in the West is currently working. I think we're seeing a systemic failure of capitalism, particularly the biggest signature was probably 2009, but the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble bursting were also signs. So what they want is something that they feel is their own. China's biggest crime in Western eyes in the last 30 years is you don't look like us. You're supposed to look like us by now, but you look like yourselves, so we don't know what to do. That's the biggest dilemma. I would say in certain areas, definitely, in wealth management, in retail banking, in terms of foreign financial institutions, stockbroking sector, yes, let in foreign companies, in franchise responsible companies. When it comes to the currency though, I don't believe China should make its currency convertible. I think it should keep that closed because I don't think the internal structures are ready for it. And it's not wrong to. I mean, if you look at Australia, even the United Kingdom, their currencies weren't really convertible until the early 70s. So all this, what China should do and what China isn't doing, is often relative to how we want China to look like us, rather than what China should be doing for itself.
Of course, China won't do our business 100% on their terms. However, compromises will have to be made. Having said this, the Financial Times recently criticized the coming foreign investment law for its perceived lack of protections, writing the quote, "The ways in which many of these provisions are to be exercised in practice are neither rigorously or fully spelled out, and some appear to be actually hollow." The article asserts that although foreign investors are given the right to appeal to various government authorities, the law doesn't establish an independent adjudication process. It conforms with one of the issues that I raised earlier, the settlement of disputes. Do you think this article of Financial Times holds any water?
I don't think it's quite justified. I mean, the hollow thing. I think we agree that the law itself is kind of general because it's aimed to lay down the foundation, the framework of the whole system. We will have implementation measures. We will have some kind of ministry-level regulations, and we will have actually the Supreme Court have last month, at the end of last month, have already passed a judicial interpretation dealing with the validity of contracts that have not been foreign investment contracts that have not been approved by the government agencies. And it has already come out in last month, end of last month. So we will have a lot of those kind of supplementing measures, supplementing documents to make a full picture. So the hollow thing or general abstract accusation, I don't think it's quite justified. As to the adjudication, lack of independent adjudication mechanism, I'm not sure what it refers to, because we have our courts to dealing with this kind of investment. And I mean, if the investors want, they can agree to submit their disputes to international arbitration. And also, actually, the academia has already discussed the possibility of establishing a foreign-related court system to dealing exclusively with the foreign-related cases. So although it's only like an academic discussion, I mean, the future, I think, should be
But that's
right.
vital. I think that's the most vital part, because I agree with you, Chinese laws improved hugely. The biggest problem is it takes so long to get implementation. And just looking to international arbitration, I still wonder why people use it. So you've got a problem in, again, Shandong province or Zhejiang province, and you've got arbitration in Frankfurt or London. The time that the case is heard there and the implementation begins here, years have passed. What needs to be done, not just for foreign companies, but also medium-sized Chinese companies, is a mechanism for swift dispute resolution based on clear contracts and obligations. That I think we all need. So I'd rather see it for all companies, and not just this emphasis that it's foreign companies that lack it. I think it's something that the whole economy would benefit from.
Actually, under the Belt and Road Initiative, the Supreme Court has already established a international commercial courts, and it's now exploring the possibility of integrate, like, courts, arbitration bodies, and even those kind of intermediation bodies to have a so-called one-stop dispute resolution.
But the problem with
mechanism.
China is that we don't have the long arm jurisdiction like what the United States does to interfere with the legal affairs of another country or a business partner. The last question is very much about your expectation on the growth rate of Chinese economy in the year 2020. Do you think the trade war will serve as a positive factor in driving the growth of the Chinese economy? David, what's your take?
I think to date it has not affected the growth, but if it, say we had no resolution this year as we expect to be signed in this month of January, there is therefore a good chance that the pressure will come off. If it had stayed, not because of the direct impact of tariffs, but because of the damage to business confidence, we could have had less than 6% growth in this year, 2020. I think we will get 6% growth easily now, as long as there is a signing of this trade agreement.
The downward economic pressure is a huge given, has a lot of uncertainty concerning prospects of the Chinese economic performance. In this context, Fan, what do you think should be the major driving force for the Chinese economy to be put at 6% GDP growth in the year 2020?
I mean, my answer is still, deepening reform and actually expand the, further opening up. Because actually the fourth preliminary meeting of the CPC Central Committee has actually make up the mind to struggle for bigger, larger, and deeper opening up. I think this should be a reaction to the situation, and we should have confidence for
greater opening up to make China a more important part of the global supply chain, and we'll make sure that this is innovation driven. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Happy New Year.